Before getting into the stories, I'd like to talk about today's sponsor, Factor 75. October is a busy month for me, and I struggle to find as much free time. Thereby, I have less time to meal prep and cook. That's why Factor has been extremely useful for me. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and leaves you more time in your day-to-day life by skipping the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, you get chef-crafted meals delivered right to your door. Factor has over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and more. Factor has been extremely convenient for me lately, as I go with the high protein options, with my favorite being Peruvian chicken with red pepper cauliflower grits and roasted broccoli, perfect for after the gym. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50nightmare to get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code 50nightmare at factor75.com to get 50% off and free shipping on your first box, plus 20% off on your next box of orders. Let me give you some context so the story I'm about to tell you is more understandable. Our cat Cosmo has always slept in the basement. Every night since I was a little kid, our parents would scoop him up from wherever he was lounging and stick him in the basement. They detested all the cat hair he'd leave behind on their bed, which I guess was understandable. He was also an outdoor cat, so if one of us forgot to put him in the basement at night, he'd wake my parents up at 3 a.m. screaming to be let out. The basement's huge, the biggest room in our house, so I figured he liked having all that space. A little over 2 weeks ago, as I'm writing this, he started acting weird. There's a little landing at the top of the basement stairs just behind the door. That's where we'd usually put him. After a few minutes, he'd walk down the stairs and sleep on whatever piece of furniture he pleased. One night, I placed him delicately on the landing and gently shut the door, something I'd done a million times. As I was filling my water glass in the kitchen though, I heard him meowing from behind the door. That was odd. He usually trotted down the stairs immediately. I finished filling my glass and walked over to the door, wondering if someone had maybe forgotten to fill his dish. I opened the door, and he darted out into the living room as if he were chasing something. I checked the dish, and it was completely full. Weird, I thought, turning to go find him. I put him back on the landing step, closed the door, and that was that. The next 2 nights were essentially the same. I'd put him on the landing, close the door, and start getting ready for bed. After a few minutes, I'd hear him repeatedly meowing. I'd go over to the door and it was always the same thing. He'd just linger at the top of the stairs, refusing to go down. I worried that maybe he was just getting old, but that was a thought I didn't want to confront just yet. It killed me to do it, but I just ignored him, knowing he'd walk down the stairs eventually. The day after that, he refused to enter the house at all. Usually when he wanted to come in, he'd just hang out at our front steps or by the back door until one of us saw him through the glass and let him inside. At one point, I noticed him curled up on our doormat. I went to let him in, but he didn't move. I went out and petted him a little before going back inside. A few hours later, I walked by the door again and saw that he still hadn't moved. It was getting late, so I picked him up and carried him inside, which he wasn't too happy about. I knew he didn't want to go to sleep downstairs, so I let him sleep in my room that night. It wasn't a big deal, and he seemed a lot calmer that way. Of course, that solution didn't last. For the next few days, my dad kept complaining that someone was leaving the basement door open. He was mad because it was letting all the cool air escape downstairs. Air conditioning wasn't free, which was something he loved reminding us. I assumed it was my sister. She's always been the type to leave doors and drawers open without thinking. I didn't really pay it that much thought. I was just happy that Cosmo seemed to have mellowed out after being allowed to sleep in my room. One night, I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. In my groggy, half-awake state, I glanced over to the door and saw something weird. There was a silhouette standing in my bedroom doorway. It was just standing there, perfectly still. I could tell it was a person because I could see their outline in the faint glow of the lamp we'd leave on in the den. I figured it had to be my sister, so I called out to her, but the figure moved away without a word. I was too tired to figure out what she wanted, so I just went back to sleep. A couple of days later, we discovered what had been keeping Cosmo away from the basement. A flea infestation. The whole place was crawling with them. It was disgusting. We assumed the fleas were the reason Cosmo had refused to go down there, which made sense, but it was strange how they came out of nowhere. We'd never had a flea problem before, and Cosmo always wore a flea collar. My dad yelled at my mom for not changing out his collar, even though she swore she had. My dad went all out, tearing through every corner of the basement to clean it thoroughly. We vacuumed the carpets, sprayed the entire room, and washed everything down with flea-killing solutions. He told us to stay out of the basement for the next few days so that any stragglers would die off without a host. It seemed like a good plan, and I figured that'd be the end of it. But then, a few nights later, another strange thing happened. I was lying in bed when I noticed light seeping in under my door, flickering on and off like someone was playing with the hallway switch. I told myself it was probably just my dad getting up to use the bathroom or something. But the flickering continued, going on for longer than seemed normal. It was starting to freak me out, but I couldn't bring myself to check it out. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the bottom of the door, hoping it would stop. Eventually, it did. I forced myself to fall asleep after that, but I've never felt more uneasy in my life. A few more days passed without incident. My dad said the basement was probably clear, which was great because I'd been missing playing video games down there. After getting home from school, I went down to the basement. As soon as I got down the stairs, though, I noticed something was wrong. There were still fleas down there, a decent amount of them. It didn't make any sense. After all the cleaning, they should have been long gone. I went back upstairs to call my dad at work, but he just said to give it time. He insisted that any fleas left would die soon enough. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on, though. It wasn't normal for fleas to keep thriving like that after everything we'd done. So the next day after school, I decided to investigate a bit further. I went down to the back of the basement and into the storage room where we kept some old boxes and tools, figuring maybe a rodent had gotten in and died somewhere. I opened the door and instantly knew I was right. The smell hit me almost immediately. This thick, rotten stench that clung to the air and made my eyes water. I followed the smell to the far end of the room, where there was an unfinished crawl space that connected to the plumbing for the whole house. It was pitch black back there, and the smell only got stronger as I stepped closer. I didn't want to go in there. It was too dark anyway. I turned to grab a flashlight, and that's when I heard it. Breathing. It was faint at first, but steady, like someone was hiding in there. I froze. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. The breathing got louder, as if whoever or whatever it was coming closer. I backed away. Before I could react, I saw a figure lunge toward the end of the crawl space, moving fast. A hand reached out for me, but I jumped away before it could grab me. I didn't stay to get a better look. I ran upstairs as fast as I could, slammed the basement door shut, and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the house, but there was no sign of anyone. They found some empty chip bags and food wrappers stashed in the crawl space, but that was it. Whoever had been down there had escaped through the storm door at the back of the basement. The officer said it was probably a homeless person who'd snuck in looking for shelter, but I couldn't help but wonder how long they'd been living there and how much they'd seen. My parents were twice as shocked as I was. We've kept the basement door locked ever since, and Cosmo still won't go anywhere near that door. I don't remember every detail of this story since I was only around 7, but my parents have filled in some of the gaps over the years, and there are still bits and pieces that stick out in my memory. So here goes. I'm an only child. Yeah, it kind of sucked growing up by myself, but one of the pros meant that my parents were a lot more involved in my life. They'd really go out of their way to make sure I was thriving, and I look back appreciatively on that. Every year around Halloween, my parents would transform our basement into a haunted house. It wasn't anything fancy, just some old decorations, fake spiderwebs, strobe lights, and a lot of enthusiasm. The whole thing was for a good cause. You had to donate canned food to get in, and my parents would give everything we collected to the local food bank. They even made flyers and passed them around my school and a couple of other elementary schools nearby. The vast majority of people who came were parents of kids in my school, but there were always a handful of parents and kids that we didn't know. My parents actually welcomed that. The more strangers there were, the more food they'd be able to collect, and the greater the likelihood that the haunted house would be a hit. We lived in a pretty big brick house in Haverton, Pennsylvania. A lot of the houses in our neighborhood were fully brick for historical reasons I won't get into. That also meant that most of them were really old too, since it was kind of frowned upon to do any remodeling. Our house was the kind of place that already had a bit of an eerie vibe to it, especially at night with its old creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. Every year, my cousins Jeff, Rick, Chaz, and Eric would come down to help my parents set up and manage the night. Usually, they'd dress up in scary costumes and hide around the basement to jump out and scare my friends. That year, they decided to go all out and wore matching anonymous masks. You know, those kind of creepy white masks with the blank expressions. The haunted house was a big hit that year, as usual. We had a good crowd going by early evening, but my parents told me later that there had been a strange man who showed up before things really got started. He wasn't with any kids, which was odd since the haunted house was mostly for families. He said his wife was planning to bring their daughter later on, but he wanted to drop off some food cans early. My parents didn't recognize him, but they figured it wasn't a big deal. They thanked him, took the cans, and stood there awkwardly before he got the hint and left. As the night went on and more people showed up, the basement got pretty chaotic. I remember trying to keep up with my friends, who were screaming and laughing as we ran through the decorations. At one point, one of my friends came up to me crying, saying someone in an anonymous mask had scared her. I tried to calm her down and told her it was just one of my cousins, but then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said the person had grabbed her wrist and tried to pull her into a closet. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe she was just being dramatic, but the look on her face told me she was genuinely scared. I went and found my parents and told them what she said. They took it seriously and went down to the basement to check things out. They asked my cousins if they had seen anything strange. Jeff, Rick, and Chaz were all in their positions, and each one of them swore they hadn't done anything like that. But then my parents noticed something else. Eric wasn't at his post. Just then, everyone started to panic. Eric came running down the stairs. He said he'd taken a break to use the bathroom upstairs, and that when he came back, his anonymous mask was gone. He figured one of the other guys had taken it as a joke. That set off alarm bells for my parents, and they immediately shut down the haunted house. They made everyone leave and called the police, who came and searched the house, but of course, nothing turned up. That night, I was still a little shaken up, but I figured it was all over. I fell asleep easily enough, but then I woke up to this tapping sound. It was soft but noticeable, like someone was repeatedly knocking on my bedroom window. I was too scared to get up, so I just laid there, pulling the covers over my chin, hoping I could just fall asleep. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped and I managed to drift back to sleep. But a few hours later, I was woken up again, this time by a scratching noise. It was more urgent than the knocking had been, like someone was clawing at the window frame. I was terrified, but something inside me snapped and I threw the covers off and rushed to the window. I yanked open the curtains and my heart nearly stopped. There, staring back at me, was a person in an anonymous mask, only inches away from the glass. I screamed for my parents. They rushed into the room and I pointed frantically at the window, but by the time they looked, the person was gone. We called the police once again, and they searched the yard and surrounding area, but they didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. The property was clear. A few months passed and things settled down. The haunted house was just a memory by then, and my parents had started to ease up on their extra security measures. Then, one day, I came home from school to find an anonymous mask laying on my bed. It wasn't just any mask. It looked exactly like the ones my cousins had worn that night. But the thing that really freaked me out was the writing. Scrawled across the forehead in black Sharpie was my name. How the hell had that guy even known my name? We called the police again, but there wasn't much they could do besides file a report. My parents added more security cameras and made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight every night. They really went over the top with the security, adding a full alarm system and putting sensors on every window, including the upstairs ones. After that, nothing else happened. At least not that we could prove. The next few months were fine, but I swore I kept hearing things outside my bedroom window. Tapping, scratching, you name it. It was probably nothing, but it got to the point where I was scared to sleep in my own bed. I've since grown up and moved out of that house, but sometimes I still wonder if there was more to the story behind what happened to me all those years ago. I recently got a job at a Mexican joint in a neighboring town. The area was a bit sketchy, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. I was also pretty desperate for money, so it's not like I really had a choice. Plus, I figured working nights wouldn't be so bad, since I'd have most of the day to myself. The restaurant itself was decent enough, but the manager, Carlos, was, well, shady. He always scheduled me for the worst hours, kept me late, and never seemed particularly concerned about following the rules. He was the type of guy who made you feel like you couldn't trust him. But like I said, I didn't have much of a choice. I needed the job. One night, while closing up, I started hearing these weird noises. I was mopping the tiled floor in the kitchen when I first heard it. As I was mopping, I picked up on these two muffled sounds that sounded like soft thuds and scraping. They were coming from below the floor. It was faint at first, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The thudding and scraping would alternate, but I was positive that there were two distinct sounds I was hearing. I listened for a while, and the noises continued for a minute before stopping completely. It startled me, but I brushed it off as something small, maybe an animal outside or the pipes settling. But it kept happening. The noise would start up when the place got quiet, just as I was finishing up my cleaning. After a few nights of this, I told Carlos about it. He shrugged it off immediately and told me it was nothing and to stop worrying. He went as far as to say the restaurant didn't even have a basement. That's when I got a little suspicious. I knew he was lying because I had literally seen the window wells around the back of the building. I wanted to tell him that, but held my tongue. I figured I'd give it another day. Maybe the noises would stop on their own. Of course, the noises continued. I complained to him the next day and told him that the place must have a basement since there were literally windows below the ground. That's when he gave me this strange look and insisted that there was no basement. He told me that the previous owners of the building had sealed it years ago, and no one can get in or out. Then he told me in a firm voice to just focus on my job and stop poking around. The way he said it, so dismissive and firm, gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't want to lose the job, so I dropped it. I figured maybe it was just some animal that had somehow gotten in. It was just weird that Carlos was so insisting on not checking it out or taking me seriously. For the next few days, the noises persisted. Every night it was the same, those strange, low thuds and occasional scraping, like something or someone was moving down there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I tried to ignore it. Then one night after closing up, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a look for myself. I walked around to the back of the building where the window wells were. I crouched down and tried to peer through one of the windows. It was pitch black inside, and I couldn't see anything, even with my phone flashlight. Just as I was about to give up, a light flickered on inside the basement just for a second. Then it snapped off before I could see anything clearly. I froze, my heart racing, unsure of what I had just seen. I rushed back to my car, too freaked out to go back inside, but I didn't tell Carlos. Something about the whole situation made me feel like it was better to keep quiet. I was not prepared for what was about to happen, though. The next time I closed, I couldn't resist the urge to go check out those windows again. I fully admit that my hands were shaking as I walked around the building. I knew nothing good was going to come from poking around. I crouched down to get a good look. This time, as I leaned in closer to get a better look, I saw it. Pressed up against the glass was a face. It was a man, but not just any man. He looked completely deranged. His hair was wild and his face was filthy, like he hadn't bathed in weeks. His yellow eyes were wide, staring right at me through the glass. He bashed his head against the window and gave me this demented smile. I screamed and stumbled back, totally losing my shit. I ran for my car without looking back. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, but I managed to get in and speed off before anything else could happen. The next day, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I went straight to Carlos and told him everything. To my surprise, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he sat me down and actually told me the truth. He admitted that the person I had seen was actually his brother, who had been living in the basement. He said his brother was mentally ill, dangerous even, and Carlos had been hiding him down there to keep him out of trouble. The basement had been sealed off to the public years ago, but Carlos had found a way to let his brother live down there, away from prying eyes. He urged me not to say anything, and said he'd appreciate it if I forgot this whole thing ever happened. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to quit right then and there, but I couldn't. I was so strapped for cash that the idea of looking for another job didn't feel like a real option. so I stuck around, convincing myself it would be fine as long as I stayed away from the basement. I tried to keep my head down and avoid Carlos, but the whole thing left me on edge. A few weeks later, something happened that made me regret staying. It was late, and I had just finished closing up. As I walked to my car, I noticed something or someone lurking in the tree line next to the parking lot. It was just a figure, but I knew in my gut it was a person. I had a feeling I knew who it was. My heart started racing, but I pretended not to notice. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but then I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the same man from the basement. He was hobbling strangely toward me, but clearly moving as quickly as he could. I scrambled for my keys and managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside just as he reached the door. He slammed his face against the window, smearing it with dirt and sweat, and started pounding on the glass. I screamed, but I couldn't think straight. All I knew was I had to get out of there. I sped off as fast as I could. I'm not sure how I made it home that night without crashing. I've never been more scared in my entire life. I still thank God that he had some kind of limp, otherwise he would have definitely caught me. That was my last night working at the restaurant. I called the police from the safety of my apartment, but I never went back. I didn't want to know what happened next, whether they found the man or if Carlos got in trouble for what he'd done. I just couldn't be involved anymore. Even now, though, I can't shake the feeling that Carlos might come looking for me one day. I don't know if he'd go to great lengths to do something like that, but it's a thought that sits in the back of my head. I never found out what happened to the restaurant, Carlos, or his brother, and honestly, I don't think I want to. Maybe I'll take a drive by that restaurant sometime in the future, but for now, I want to stay as far away from that place and those people as possible. This happened maybe 8 or 9 months after I moved into my first house. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college with a decent job. All you need to know about the house is that it had a very spacious basement that I mostly used for storage. The previous owners had partitioned it into these separate rooms using plywood and exposed framing. There was the main area at the bottom of the stairs, then a laundry section, then what I think was supposed to be a workshop, and then this weird back room that was mostly just storage. It had kind of a maze-like quality to it. You couldn't see the entire basement from any single vantage point, which I remember thinking was kind of cool when I first toured the place. Anyway, it was a weeknight. I needed to go downstairs to do laundry, which was the only time I ever really went down there. The basement lights were already on, which I thought was weird, but I didn't dwell on it for whatever reason. I'd been down there a few days earlier, so I figured I just forgot to turn them off. The space was dim even with the lights. I hadn't bothered changing the old yellow incandescents that had been there when I moved in. I started walking down the stairs, and things escalated so abruptly that I couldn't react quick enough. I made it to the bottom of the stairs and started walking toward the laundry area when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head instinctively and locked eyes with a man who was crouching behind one of the folding tables that I had set up near the far corner. It was so unsettling that I almost dropped the basket. My brain refused to register what I was seeing. There was literally a stranger hiding in my basement. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at this intruder who was now staring back at me, and it was not a pleasant stare. He looked like he had just crawled out of a sewer or something. And then he stood up and ran. Not at me though, further into the basement toward the partitioned rooms in the back. That snapped me out of my fear-induced haze, and I started moving backwards toward the basement stairs. But I must have wasted too much time, because before I could reach the stairs, all the lights in the basement went out. Until that moment, I had never been down there with the lights off. I hadn't anticipated how dark it would be. It was fully pitch black down there, complete and utter darkness. I mistakenly assumed I knew my own house, so I kept moving toward the stairs, but I must have misjudged something, because I tripped and fell to the floor. By the time I got up, I was completely disoriented. The chaos and fear of the situation was overwhelming my brain, and I couldn't think. My phone was sitting on the counter upstairs, so it's not like I could just reach in my pocket and turn on the flashlight. I started screaming like a lunatic, thinking that might scare off whoever had broken into my house. But actually, that strategy must have energized them, because I started hearing screaming coming from the other side of the basement. It was terrifying. I was screaming into the darkness, trying to seem like I was crazy, and someone on the other side of the room was doing the same exact thing, and his screaming was much more intimidating than mine. He legitimately sounded like a murderer. I stopped screaming, and he followed suit. I started navigating around the basement purely by touch. I had no other choice, and I started hearing movement behind me. He must have been doing the same. The sounds were getting closer, and amidst the horror of everything, I couldn't help but get the sense that he knew my own basement better than I did. I knew I was getting closer to the stairs, but that basement is massive. I started hearing breathing coming from somewhere behind me, and I genuinely thought he was going to catch me. After what felt like an eternity, I felt the wooden base of the staircase. I grabbed the railing and started running up the stairs, but before I could even hit the second step, something grabbed my ankle and I lost my grip. My head struck the railing and I fell all the way down to the basement floor. I still couldn't see the guy, but he was dragging me away from the stairs with what genuinely felt like inhuman strength. I kicked and thrashed my legs with all my might and miraculously connected with something. The strike was just strong enough for him to lose his grip, and I twisted and twisted until I escaped his grasp. I started running back towards the stairs in the dark, and he started screaming again, but I found them before he could catch me. I made it to the top in the dark, burst through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. The nightmare was far from over, though. That door doesn't have a lock, so I had no choice but to press my weight against it and hope I was strong enough to keep him out. Just as I suspected, I heard footsteps pounding up the basement stairs mere seconds later, followed by a huge crash against the door. The door swung open for a terrifying second, and it took everything in my power to push it closed. The first impact must have emboldened him, because he started repeatedly slamming into the door. I yanked off my socks and pushed against the door, knowing my life depended on it. I have no idea how he did make it through, but he eventually gave up. I heard footsteps crashing back down the basement stairs, and I immediately seized the opportunity to grab my phone. I ran over to the counter, grabbed it, and ran back to the basement door. With my back pressed against the door again, I called the police. When they finally arrived, that guy was gone. I kind of had a feeling. One of the basement windows had been forced open from the outside, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what happened. There was nothing missing or stolen, so one of the officers suggested that the intruder was probably using my basement as a place to live or hide. That hadn't crossed my mind, but it was somehow a worse thought than him simply wanting to rob the place. The other reason the police arrived at that theory was that the intruder somehow knew where the light switch was, which wasn't in the most obvious place. It made sense. I ended up moving out about 4 months after the incident. Thinking about this again has confirmed something for me. That guy was fully prepared to kill me that night, and if things had played out differently, he just might have. This happened when I was 14. I'm in my 30s now, so we're talking close to 20 years ago at this point. My parents had to drive out of state for a wedding and didn't want to leave me alone, despite the fact that I was staying at home alone age. So the original plan was for my older sister to stay with me for the weekend. She was already in college at the time, but she only lived an hour away. As soon as my parents left, though, she texted me and told me she had some party to go to and wasn't going to come. I didn't really care. I didn't even bother telling my parents about it, partly because I didn't want to stress them out and partly because I didn't want them to find someone else to watch me. It wasn't like the house was in some sketchy area either. It was a typical 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The place mostly consisted of families too, so I knew I'd be fine. The evening was completely uneventful. I played Halo for like 6 hours, something I'd ordinarily never get to do. It wasn't until just after midnight where things started getting weird. I was still lounging on the couch when I heard this faint tapping sound. The sound came from somewhere in the backyard, and I immediately assumed it was something hitting the siding of the house. That's honestly what it sounded like, so I wasn't too concerned. A few minutes later, though, I heard it again. The sound was nearly identical, which gave me the impression that it was a tree branch hitting the same spot on the house. But then the tapping migrated, like whatever was making it was moving along the side of the house. That's when I knew something was wrong. The sound was far too intentional to not be made by something sentient. I muted the TV and froze. I didn't want to move. I just sat there listening the way anyone would, but now there was just silence. After maybe a minute, I convinced myself that it had just been a scuttling animal or the wind, and I turned the TV back on. 20 minutes later, there was a new noise, one that made me a lot more concerned. It was another tapping sound. But this time, it sounded like it was coming from below me, from the basement. The living room was directly above the basement, so it had to be coming from there. It was an unfinished basement with a little kitchenette in the corner, so it wasn't crazy to imagine a critter rummaging around in there. I muted the TV again, this time getting up off the couch. I was dreading it, but I had to check. I had to at least assure myself that nothing was wrong. The basement had several windows that led directly to the outdoors, so in all likelihood, the raccoon or stray cat that had been making the first noise was now knocking against one of those windows for whatever reason. I tried to convince myself I wasn't freaking out and walked over to the basement door. I opened it and stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness. The tapping noise was louder now, happening every few seconds or so. I don't know why I did this, but I called out hello into the nothingness. The tapping stopped immediately. That's when I started feeling really uneasy, because if it had just been an animal, it probably wouldn't have reacted to my voice like that. If I could just turn on the lights, I'd get a much clearer view of everything. But the light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, and there was a 0% chance I was going down there. So instead, I swung the door closed until it was only open a crack and stuck my hand through. I pointed my phone over to where I knew the window was. Then I closed my eyes and recorded a video with the flash on for a few seconds. Then I immediately shut the door and locked it. I took a deep breath and pulled up the video. It was pretty grainy, but it took me all of 1 second to realize there was a figure standing underneath one of the windows, on the inside of the house. I screamed, I couldn't control myself, and I ran to my room. I locked the door and immediately called my dad, who called the police for me. I was still on the phone with my parents when I started hearing repeated banging on the basement door. That guy was trying to break into the finished part of our house. And then, after the 5th or 6th bang or so, there was silence again, and then the police showed up. They searched the basement, but that guy had escaped through the window. The officers were actually nice enough to search our yard, but that guy was long gone. There was a bunch of stuff missing from the basement. Like I said before, it wasn't finished, but that didn't mean my parents left it empty. I can't remember everything that had been stolen, but the scariest thing by far was this. When the police inspected the kitchenette, they found the biggest knife in the rack missing. It was a terrifying thought. If it weren't for the video on my phone, I don't think the police would have taken things as seriously as they did. But of course, nothing ever came of it, and this was almost 20 years ago now. I have no idea what happened to that old phone. It's probably buried in a box of junk in my parents' house somewhere, if it even still exists. If I ever find it and the thing still turns on, I'll submit the footage. This happened when I was 16, 4 years ago now. I grew up in this big suburban house that my parents bought before I was born. It's one of those places that looks normal from the outside, but has all these weird quirks once you're inside. The biggest quirk by far is the basement. It's easily the largest room in the house. My parents finished it years ago and turned it into this casual hangout space with a sectional couch, a decent TV, and a couple of storage rooms in the back. You'd think a space like that would get a lot of use, but my parents are the type who prefer the living room upstairs. So basically, the basement is essentially mine. The other thing you need to know about is my cat. His name is Rocky, and he's one of those annoyingly friendly cats that constantly needs attention. Because of that, my parents put him in the basement every night before they go to sleep so he doesn't bother them. Now here's where things get a little sketchy, and I'm just going to be honest about it because there's no point in pretending otherwise. The basement has this interior door that connects directly to the garage. It's technically supposed to be a convenience thing for bringing in groceries or whatever, but for me, it was a convenience thing for sneaking people in. Anyway, it was a Friday night when this went down. I remember that specifically because I had invited this girl Madeline over, which I wouldn't have done on a school night. I also remember assuming Rocky was already down there. It wasn't a conscious thought, more so an implied assumption. It was past the time when my parents usually put him down there, so I figured he was asleep somewhere in the back, as per usual. That's why I didn't freak out when I heard a noise from one of the storage rooms. It was this faint rustling sound, like something moving around in the boxes. To be completely honest, I feel like I was justified in keeping my cool because it sounded like the exact sound an energetic cat might make. Madeline obviously tensed up a little, but I explained to her that it was just my cat, and then we went back to pretending to watch whatever was on the TV. But the noises kept happening. Not constantly, but every few minutes there'd be another rustle or a soft thud. Each time, Madeline would give me a worried look, and I'd have to assure her that he was just a very active cat and liked to climb on things. Which was true, he did like to climb on things. I was still 100% calm, right up until I heard scratching coming from the door at the top of the basement stairs. The door that led to the main part of the house. I instantly knew what I was hearing. It was Rocky scratching at the door to get into the basement, meaning he wasn't already down there with us, which also meant that whatever noises I'd been hearing for the past half hour were not him. I didn't say anything right away, partly because I didn't want to scare Madeline, and partly because I didn't know whether I believed what I was hearing. But before I could react, Madeline, who was still sitting right next to me, started screaming like she was being stabbed. I whipped my head around and realized she was pointing behind me, toward the back of the basement. I turned my head a little further and literally froze in fear. There was a foam football rolling across the floor, clearly having just been thrown out of the storage room. There was someone in there. I didn't see anyone. The back of the basement was too dark, but there was no other explanation. Someone was back there. Someone had been back there the whole time. Without thinking, I grabbed Madeline's arm and practically dragged her up the stairs. As soon as we made it up, I slammed the door behind us, careful not to let Rocky down there. Things got really chaotic after that. Madeline was crying, which was the first issue, but I was also shaking. Until that moment, I didn't even know I could get that scared. My parents eventually realized what was going on and called the police, who showed up a few minutes later. I stood on the back deck and watched the garage the entire time to make sure the intruder didn't slip out from there. Here's where things got weird though. The police ended up searching the entire basement, including the garage, but didn't find anyone. There were also no signs of forced entry, and all the basement windows were locked from the inside. One of the officers suggested the intruder must have slipped out through the garage before they arrived, but I know that's not possible. I was watching it the entire time. I would have seen them. But after searching the house, there was nothing else that the police could do. Of course, my parents also thought the intruder had slipped away without me realizing it, and I could tell they were upset. My dad especially. But I don't care what they think. I'm 100% certain that no one escaped through the garage. There's only one path from the garage to the outdoors, and I had my eyes on it the entire time. My family never got a resolution to all of this, and I still have no explanation for everything that happened. I think every kid is afraid of basements. Let's face it, they're scary places. Even as an adult now who lives alone, I sometimes find myself a little uncomfortable going down to the basement to do laundry at night. At least I feel that way going up the stairs as I leave. But as a kid, I was terrified of the basement in my family house. Ironically, all our video game consoles were down there since it was the only other TV in the house besides the living room and my parents' room. I believe this happened when I was 9 because I remember being in elementary school, but one of my last years. On the weekends, I liked to stay up playing video games in the basement. One of my old favorites was Driver 2 on the PS1. For whatever reason, I could never beat the game, and I'd spend countless nights trying to do so. Well, it was one of those nights I was down there playing. I usually didn't like being up too late because the second my parents went to sleep, I'd be too scared to be down in the basement. Just the idea of my mom or dad watching TV upstairs was enough to make me feel somewhat safe, knowing they were a quick run up the stairs away. Similar to my current house today, my old family home had the laundry/boiler room in the basement. That room terrified me because it was pitch black at all hours of the day due to there being absolutely no windows. Also, weird sounds always came from in there, as to be expected I guess since it's a boiler room. There were definitely a handful of times where I stopped my game to listen when I thought I heard an unusual sound come from in there, even with the door closed. On this particular night, I did in fact hear an unusual sound, and it started with the sound of the laundry room door creaking open. This obviously was enough to make me pause my game and frighten me. There was an uncomfortable silence in the basement for a second, and it was then followed by what I can only describe as the sound of a woman moaning or groaning in an almost ghost-like way. But it sounded like my mom's voice. In fact, I knew it was. I started laughing, and I'm sure I said something like, "Nice try, Mom," knowing she was trying to scare me, which, side note, looking back, even as a kid, I should have realized something was wrong, considering my mom has never been a goofy person that would pull this kind of prank. But I walked over to the laundry room with a little more confidence now, and as I was in front of the open doorway leading into the darkness, the groans had stopped by now. I looked straight into the pitch-black room ahead, and as I inched closer, the outline of a person standing in there became visible. "Mom?" I said, now with less confidence. When I got just close enough, I made the judgment that it was not my mom. I started screaming as I ran up the stairs to the living room, and my horrific judgment was right. There was my mom in the living room with my dad. At this point, they were both already standing up responding to my screams. I yelled, "There's a woman in the laundry room," and I remember they looked at each other, and then both ran down to the basement, slamming the door shut behind them. I sat confused, scared, but slightly relieved knowing my parents were down there now. I remember being in the living room for a long time before my mom came upstairs and told me to go to my room and go to sleep. I didn't ask questions and obeyed. I had a hard time falling asleep that night, I'm sure, but I remember the next morning. My parents told me they had one of their friends prank me to scare me, and they treated it like it was one big joke. I don't fully remember how much I believed it or not, but I for sure asked them to elaborate on who it was. My mom said it was one of her friends from out of state who was visiting. I didn't question it, but as I got older, the name Debbie was seemingly accidentally dropped by my parents a few times, and whenever I'd ask who Debbie is, they'd have a different response. When I was maybe 14, I thought back one day on this night and decided to do a deep dive. I found a family tree type of website and admittedly stole my dad's credit card from his wallet momentarily to pay for the service, then slipped it back in the wallet. I inputted both my parents' names. Among a few familiar names and a bunch of names I didn't recognize, what instantly stood out was that my mom had a sister named Debbie. So I googled Debbie followed by my mom's maiden name, and up popped an obituary. She was dead. I ran to grab my parents to show them what I found on the screen, and I demanded they explain. I remember their shocked and nervous looks on their faces still. "Tell him," my dad said to my mom. My mom then dropped the bomb on me that I had a very mentally unstable aunt who harmed a lot of people, and it was for the best that she was always kept away from me growing up. Debbie had allegedly broken into or snuck into the house without my parents knowing. I had so many questions and demanded answers, but there was little more that they would tell me. They swore they had my best interests at heart. Over the years, I'd occasionally bring it up, but they'd always shut it down and tell me to drop it. I never learned what they meant by "she harmed a lot of people," but I have some theories. It doesn't really do me any good dwelling on it though. It makes me kind of nervous to think about it. What else were my parents hiding? What happened to Debbie? Why was she in the basement? I wondered a few times if my parents were hiding her down there after she had done something horrible, but that wouldn't make much sense because I don't think they'd let me down there in the basement then. I guess some questions are better left unanswered.